So good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you joining us from Abidjan or Addis. I'm not sure where all you are. Welcome to the Elliott School of International Studies at George Washington University, and to today's event on Africa after COVID, charting a new course for economic growth and development. My name's Jennifer Cook, and I direct the Institute for African Studies, which serves as a hub within the university for discussion, research, debate, and activities on Africa. In this past year, we've hosted a series of events that profile the perspectives of leading Africa-based institutions and practitioners and thought leaders, including the African CDC with Dr. Nkengasong, the African Union Trade and Investment Commission with Dr. Albert Mashanga, the UN Office in West Africa and Sahel. And today we're delighted to continue in that vein with this event and our distinguished speakers. Also on the call, I believe, are Ambassador Liberata Mulamula, who's Associate Director of the Institute, and visiting Professor of International Affairs, Elgassim Wan. And I just wanted to thank them very much for supporting and helping out with today's event. We're delighted to be partnering with the Institute for International Economic Policy, IIEP, at GW, whose affiliates have, since the early days of the pandemic, been producing a great deal of analysis and commentary, helping us understand the economic impacts. And so before introducing the panel and the event, I did want to turn to the co-director of IIEP, Jay Shamba, just to say a few words. So Jay, I'll turn to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening for that matter, depending where you are. My name is Jay Shamba. I'm the co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, as we call it here at GW. We at IIEP are really happy to be co-hosting this important event on Africa's economy post-COVID. IIEP is located at the Elliott School at GW and is kind of a cross-school, cross-disciplinary research center that aims to serve as kind of a catalyst for high quality, multidisciplinary, and nonpartisan research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization. And we interpret that mandate pretty broadly. It includes areas around trade, international finance, international development, poverty studies, climate change, or economic policy more broadly. We've also had a focus around certain areas of the world, including China's economy, India's economy. We've also held a number of events on Africa's economy and are again, just really happy to be working with the Institute for African Studies today. We've been very busy at IIEP lately, so please take a look at our website if you want to see the many events that we have either recently done that you could watch or that are coming up. We've also been, as Jennifer mentioned, very active on the topic of the economic policy response to COVID. And you can see kind of all the work from our affiliates on that topic posted on our website as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Jennifer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jay. So to today's event, look, COVID has swept across the world with devastating impact on human health and livelihoods. And it has revealed and deepened existing vulnerabilities and disparities within societies and economies and within the global system. For all of us, I think wherever we sit, the crisis compels new thinking on the path to recovery and how to address some of the vulnerabilities and fissures it revealed. Africa has been particularly hard hit. African economy shrinking on average by more than 2% last year, and then emerging out of the crisis with a heavy burden of debt. So today we're going to look and hear from we're going to look at this with our stellar panel, which represents institutions that will be at the forefront of this recovery and shaping thinking on the African continent, to discuss kind of what new tools and approaches are needed to speed Africa's recovery and build future resilience, what role for these institutions and global multilateral institutions in that recovery and growth. And then, you know, as we in the US have a new administration in place, it's worth thinking about what our panelists see as entry points for kind of broader international solidarity and support, and what it might mean if you want to go there in terms of US policy and how best the US might engage. So I'll briefly introduce our panel. They have quite long CVs, so I'll try to keep it relatively short. We'll begin with Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, who's from Niger of origin. He's the CEO of the African Union Development Agency and the New Economic Partnership for African Development, NEPAD, which is now in its 20th year, mandated to facilitate and coordinate implementation of regional and continental priority development programs. He's a professor and a practitioner. He served as Prime Minister of Niger, and was a Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister in charge of African integration and cooperation. And he taught in Niger, in Venezuela, and France on public administration and international affairs. So Dr. Mayaki, welcome to you. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you. Our next guest is not yet arrived. She is being stuck in Dulles, but should be arriving shortly. Dr. Vera Songwe, who is the Undersecretary General of the UN and Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, ECA. She was appointed in 2017 and became the first woman to lead the institution in its 60 years history. So shout out in the day after International Women's Day. And Dr. Songwe's reforms within the UN have focused on ideas for prosperous Africa. She's brought a great deal of energy and innovative thinking on development finance, private sector growth, digital transformation, and so forth. Prior to ECA, she held a number of senior leadership roles with the International Finance Corporation and World Bank. When I first met her, she was a top advisor to Dr. Ngozi Konjo-Iweala, who now leads the WTO. And then finally, Dr. Khaled Sherif is Vice President for Regional Development, Integration, and Business Delivery at the African Development Bank, based in Abidjan. Previously, he worked for many years and held several senior positions at the World Bank. He has worked at the Agency for International Development in Egypt and at the Egyptian Ministry of Cabinet Affairs. He too is a practitioner and professor, and among the several institutions at which he's taught are the Business School at George Washington University. So welcome back, welcome home, Dr. Sherif. Again, we're delighted to have this really top-notch panel to talk about this very timely issue. I'm going to turn first to Dr. Mayaki to lead us off, about 15 minutes to 20 minutes per speaker, and then we want to save ample time for questions and answers from the audience. So Dr. Mayaki, I turn to you. Do ask, and it looks like everybody has, that if you're not speaking, you mute your mic. But that looks like everyone's doing that. So welcome, Dr. Mayaki, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cook, and it's a pleasure to be invited for this interaction, and I'm really pleased to be able to share views with the high-profile panelists for this session. I wasn't sure really about the main aspects and points which I was going to raise, and because so many things have been said on the post-COVID. I don't like the expression post-COVID because I think we will stay with COVID for some time. And the post is a bit, it's not optimistic, but it is not really realistic. So I will look at the situation on the basis of a transitional approach, because I think we are in a transition in what refers to Africa. So I will divide my points in three categories. I'll talk about the context globally, allude to the things that we are doing as the African Union Development Agency, which was created after the reform that President Kagame led, because we had a very high level of criticism towards the efficiency, the efficacy of the African Union. So that reform took place under the leadership of President Kagame, and he decided that it was necessary to have a development agency focused on implementation, which could produce concrete results. And then my third part will be about the future and the uncertainties. So regarding the current context, I know Vera will come back on the economic issues, and I will not focus as much on the economic issues because she will deal with them in a much more competent manner than I would. First point is Africa is going into a recession, as you all know, for the first time in the last 20, 25 years. We were having quite good economic growth rates. Growth was not sufficiently inclusive. As a matter of fact, it's interesting that the theme of this session is economy growth and development, which you separated the two concepts, which is quite interesting. So we already, we were growing, it's true. We made quite important structural reforms. Our macroeconomic indicators were not that bad. Evidently, when I say Africa, you always have to bear in mind that there are several Africa, at least 4 or 5 of them. And one of them is doing much better than all the others, which is the East part, the West African community. But globally, if you put aside, let's say, 10 to 12 countries which are really lagging behind, most of the continent was having good economic growth rates and a good management of its public policies, relatively. And the eruption of a crisis, evidently, has had 2 main consequences, which are not frequently talked about. The first one is that the planning systems imploded because the reduction of the fiscal space created a situation where public resources were severely reduced. And when public resources are severely reduced, you need to reallocate the resources that you have. And in that reallocation, you need to provide a rationale. And that rationale needs to be based on priorities. And the former priorities are not evidently the priorities that you are going to enhance with reduced resources. And if I always repeat the fact that the main, if you want to understand the strategy, the economic strategy or the development strategy of a country, look at its budget. Don't look at the strategic papers, because the strategic papers are always framed in a way which are interesting, but which do not reveal the reality of a strategy. But when you look at the way resources are allocated, you can derive a strategy, and sometimes you have important surprises. The budget goes in one direction and the strategy goes in another direction. But coming back to my first point regarding the consequences, the implosion of a planning system with a low institutional quality makes reprioritization really a serious issue to tackle. And it's not only an issue which has to do with African governments, it has to do also with the partners which are supporting Africa, from African Development Bank to World Bank to bilaterals to etc. Because they also are trying to catch up with that reprioritization. So you have the implosion of a planning system and a reprioritization which is not always rational. And then you have the support of the international community, well, partners, the donors, which is trying to find a coherence in establishing the proper links. So that's the first consequence. And this first consequence has to be linked to a second one, which is the impact that the crisis had on the governance systems. The credibility of most of the governments was based on the fact that we were growing, extreme poverty was slowing down, inequalities, even if Africa is still the most unequal region in the world, inequalities were a little bit shrinking, but we could send a narrative and governments could play on a narrative which was a positive narrative. And suddenly, with the crisis, the public communication of the governments is severely hit because the king is naked and the king is showing its weaknesses. So with a limited narrative and a limited, with a changed narrative per se, and a limited capacity of reform given the reduction of the fiscal space, the credibility of the governance systems is quite affected. Just one example, but there will be many other examples like Senegal. Senegal was a very stable country, good macroeconomic framework. I mean, things were going quite well. Infrastructure development was moving quite well. And you saw what happened last week. I mean, youngsters, without any affiliation to any party, just started to go into the streets, rampaging and contesting the system, burning the images of President Sall, and who was elected quite heavily in the last elections. So the second consequence is on the governance systems and the credibility of the governments. And this is a domain which will have to be quite well looked at and taken into account. In my view, the management of the economic consequences, well, the management and the reform of a governance system is as important as the management of the economic consequences. Because a separation has taken place. Separation is not the right term. The conditions of credibility of governments have been reviewed by communities, population, civil society actors, private sector, etc. So this is a dossier, an issue, which will have to be looked at quite carefully. The third consequence, in my view, has to do with the control of a territory. What do I mean by that? Fundamentally, let's say 2/3 of African countries have problems with the control of their national space for many reasons, and many of them have tried decentralization processes in order to delegate authority and responsibility at local level. The control of the local level of the territorial administration is an important factor for the stability of most of our governments. So this link can be harmed quite importantly because of the restriction of public resources. Many local governments were counting on a centralized government in order to really be operational and functional. And if this link is shaken, we could face issues of instability because the control of a territory would be quite armed. So most of the factors I highlighted are not, let's say, very positive. But what is positive in these processes? What is positive is that many questions are being asked on what does development really look like? The ordinary African who looks ordinary in the proper sense of the word, who looks at how the health systems of developed countries have been shaken, is asking to himself the question, what does development really look like? Because developed countries have faced a crisis which they could, let's say, hardly manage, and they were supposed to be developed. So in terms of thinking or rethinking about development, what does it mean to us? Should we have another view? Evidently, they know that primary healthcare is important, vaccination is important, they know that nutrition is important, they know that all these issues are important, but food security is important. But the way it has been framed and provided is being questioned. And it's not only being questioned by ordinary Africans, but also questioned among academic circles. And you hear, I'm sure you hear that more and more, that expression, rethinking development. And in rethinking development, there is a critical issue which comes on board, which is the issue of if the credibility of government has been weakened, can we still believe that governments have the authority required in order to design public policies? So slowly there is that concept of co-production of policies which is emerging. From Malawi to Kenya to Mauritania to even you can go to Algeria and Senegal, etc. Policies should no longer be the monopoly of governments which have shown their limits. They have to be co-produced. And it's a big question. I don't have an answer to that, but this is an issue which is coming on board as a critical one. And it will have an effect on the proper role of the state. And I think, given our demographic composition, with this cohorts of youth coming on the employment market every year, with our demographic growth rate, the pressure to go towards co-production of policies will need to be taken into account for the sake of stability. Because in the short and mid-term, we will hardly be able to change things. Change will take place from the mid to the long term. And in order for change to take place from the mid to the long term, other actors apart from the state will need to be implicated in the production of policies. And so my second part, I don't know how long did I talk, 10 minutes? Okay. So I must have 5 minutes. I will talk 2 minutes about what we are doing at the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. We have reprioritized fully our work plan. We have focused much more on health-related issues, and we have linked our health-related solutions to digitalization, because for us, digital transformation is a fundamental priority. Just before attending this meeting, I was with the CEO of Vodacom, on a mobile-enabled solution in terms of dissemination of vaccines. So it's just to show that this is digital transformation is very important, and it's linked to health issues is very important. Second domain where we have reprioritized is a concept that we call homegrown solutions. With a Boston consulting group, we have defined what we call an accelerator in order to identify a certain number of startups in the health and agri-food systems, which have a potential to grow and be mature, and to accompany them in terms of capacitating them to be able to grow. And thirdly, in terms of resilience, we have a specific program which gives a very high importance to the link between energy, climate, and agriculture. So we believe a lot in multi-sectoral solutions and no sectoral solutions. I don't have time to go into what we do, but I just wanted to give a few examples of what we do. Third part of my intervention, the future. The future will depend fundamentally on power issues. And I'm profoundly convinced, but I'm talking subjectively. So and I want to say that I'm talking subjectively on this issue. There are going to be, in my view, I might be wrong, but very strong transformations, social transformations in the continent. Not all of them will be easy. Most of them will be violent because the expectations of a vast majority of populations are very high, and they don't want to hear objectives on 20 years, 25 years, etc. It's true that we have the Agenda 2063, but when we talk about it, we are extremely careful in doing a segmentization. So the future will highly depend on how this youthful population is organized, because by the time they get organized, they will know very clearly that they can seize power at any time. It has been seen in many other countries. It happened in Burkina Faso. It almost happened in Nigeria. We saw it in Egypt. We will see it in other countries like Nigeria. We'll see it in South Africa, etc. So the future will depend a lot on the capacity of the governments to establish an intelligent communication with their youth, so that disruptions are not violent. And the second consequence, and I will end by this. The second consequence will need to do with the gender issues. Just an anecdote. Gender issues really were not part of my thinking. 20 years ago, when I was Prime Minister, I can say it because I regret it. It's a mea culpa. By convention, we would establish a ministry in charge of women empowerment, but it was really the least of our priorities. Luckily, the reality of the transformations that have taken place have demonstrated to us that the future of this continent will fundamentally depend on women's empowerment and women's liberation. And this is really an economic issue. It's not an issue of, evidently, parity has to go through, etc., but it will be a fundamental aspect. I'm sorry, I see a hand which has been raised. I think I've gone over my time, but thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Actually, that was me clapping.
Okay.
On the point on women's empowerment. So thank you, Dr. Mayaki. Such an excellent, thought-provoking presentation, and particularly kind of the planning disruptions, the credibility of governments, and the trust and the social compact. I mean, it's something you also got at. Great, lots of food for thought there, and we'll come back in during question and answer. So thank you very much. We have been joined by Dr. Vera Songwe, I mispronounced. Dr. Songwe, welcome. I introduced you at the outset. I'm glad you've made it out of the luggage lounge at the airport. Welcome, and we're very much looking forward to kind of your thoughts on new thinking, the role of your organization, but also perhaps how the kind of multilateral organizations and partners like the United States might contribute and engage in some of the ideas you've been putting forward. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much. Again, apologies for joining late, but totally beyond my control, travel constraints. Normally the flight comes in at 7 a.m. So you're sort of out and about, but it was late coming in and late getting the luggage out maybe. So apologies for that. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody that is listening. I think thank you for inviting the Economic Commission for Africa to join this conversation. When Dr. Mayaki has spoken, there is always very little more to add, but my brother Gassam wanted us to have this conversation. So I think I would maybe structure the conversation around sort of three buckets. A bucket on sort of, what is happening in Africa today? Where are we? What has been exactly, as you said, a little bit the multilateral response? What is the medium-term perspective? And then what do we see as a sort of global overall, what we call reset? And so at the ECA, we're calling it sort of the response, recovery, and reset, if you want to sort of those three buckets. On the response bucket, which is essentially, it is the bucket that says, we should have been talking about the response last year and almost getting into the recovery this year. But as we see, I think all of us are still in a response phase, so to speak, essentially because I think that the amount of resources that were needed to respond to the crisis came very slowly. Initially, we thought, okay, $2 trillion, $4 trillion will do it in the developed world. Clearly, in the US, clearly we see that it's not. You need 6 and maybe 8 or 10 just to do the response. I think that historians, and particularly economic historians that are studying this, will say that, in the Great Depression, one of the mistakes that we made was that we responded very slowly. And because we responded very slowly, the depression lasted longer and cost more lives, and the economic recovery took much longer. History repeats itself. Whether we learn from history is a different story. I think history will tell us in 10 years whether we did learn or not. On the African continent, I think we did not learn. The response was very slow to come. African countries themselves put together about 2% of GDP as their own response, but we needed more. I think with the Economic Commission for Africa, we had a meeting with African finance ministers, which called for an immediate response of about $100 billion. $100 billion, when you think about it in the sort of grander scheme of things, it was not sort of, something that was out of the reach of the international community, but I think it just took long to come. And the G20 eventually, and I must again congratulate the IMF, and I don't know if everybody has done that before, for really coming out very quickly to respond, first by deciding to cancel the debt of all the very low income countries that owed any interest payments to the IMF for last year, 2020, but also by saying, they will double the quota for access to the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. So they were able, the IMF was able to really lean forward and come in quickly with the response, which was the right thing to do, but IMF did not have enough liquidity to respond to the crisis. So we were fortunate on the continent because the health crisis, or the first phase of the health crisis, didn't hit us as fast or as big or as hard. And so we were able to get in place, working with the African Union, working with the African envoys, to put up what we call the African Medical Supplies Platform. As you would have seen in most of the West, there was this big conversation around PPEs. We didn't have that problem. So that was sort of, why are we still talking about the response? The second part of the response is the health response. The health response to reopen our economies is vaccines. And as we are all seeing, the vaccines conundrum is a huge one. It's a global one. Nobody has enough. Nobody is not getting there on time. Even if it gets there, it's not getting into the arms of people on time. Even if we're getting the first vial, are we getting the second one? So there's still a lot of conversation around the vaccines. On the continent, of course, we had the COVAX facility that was put in place first to vaccinate 20% of Africa's populations. I think the number's now gone up to 30%. The African Vaccinations Acquisition Task Team, called the AVAT, is now taking care of the last 30%. They have some resources, but we don't have access to the vaccines. Again, a little bit, one could question, the security of the continent was put in the hands of the Serum Institute in India. One institution was supposed to produce all these vaccines. Clearly, they cannot do that as well as produce for the rest of the world. So there is a question of, can we begin to produce more vaccines on the continent? Johnson & Johnson, we're very happy, has now been approved, at least for emergency use. It has a factory in South Africa, and so we're hoping that the South African Johnson & Johnson factory will also be able to come to Africa's needs. Now, as we talk, so this is the response which we're still in and we're still working on. And you asked Jennifer about US leadership. I think, we cannot be more happy than to say, when we read what David Lipton wrote in, I think it was the Washington Post, and of course, the first female US Treasury Secretary. So we were just following on Mayaki, and I'm still wearing orange from yesterday. Secretary Yellen has now come out very strongly endorsing, the special drawing rights. Special drawing rights are a kind of money creation. It's global money creation. So, the central banks of the world get together and say, we'll create more money. It's a little bit like the US stimulus. The US stimulus is money creation from the US Treasury. Special drawing rights are money creation from the collective of the world's treasuries, or the world's central banks, to be more precise and accurate. So we have been asking again at the Economic Commission for Africa with African finance ministers for the release of the issuance of 500 new special drawing rights, 500 billion new special drawing rights. Africa will get about 25.6 billion of that because it's based on a quota system. So we are now also asking, and so we still have to go back to Treasury Secretary Yellen to say, work with us, but we believe that, we may get that. We're asking for a redistribution. And not a voluntary redistribution, but an on-lending. So essentially that the developed countries, and just to give you a sense, if we issue 500 billion SDRs, all of Africa, 54 countries and counting, will get 25.6 billion. The G7 countries will get 217 billion. Now, understanding that the G7 countries have already issued stimuluses for themselves because they have central banks that have had currency, this extra 217 billion is not dire straits needed by the G7 and other countries. So what we are asking is that the G7 on lend, not give it for free, but on lend at US Treasury rates, which is about 1% or even lower now, those resources to the IMF, for example, inside the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust as one vehicle, maybe to pay for vaccines, maybe a second vehicle, which is what we are all asking for as well, is to ensure that countries that have market access continue to have market access, but at cheaper rates. And this is how we're going to get the recovery, because we have focused in the response on saving the sovereigns, the states. We haven't thought a lot about the private sector, but we all know that job creation happens in the private sector. So how do we then see whether we can put resources in the hands of the private sector? The SDRs are a way of doing that because they provide the foreign currency for businesses to start reinvesting in capital accumulation, to start doing import-export businesses, trade credits. That's what the SDRs will do for us. They go to shore up reserves and shore up foreign exchange. And then, of course, as we do and think about the build back, one of the things we need to think about is how we build back greener. And again, US leadership, Jennifer, to your question, very happy to see Senator Kerry as the new envoy on sort of the green recovery as we work with the UK for Glasgow and COP26. One of the big things that we're talking about is how is it that, how can we make sure that there is a carbon tax? Again, the IMF has come out very strong on this. We're talking a lot about domestic resource mobilization of developing countries. A huge way of ensuring that we are able to get more revenue is through putting a price on carbon. I just came last week from Congo, from the Congo Basin. The Congo Basin is the second sort of heart of the world. They sequester 3 years of the world's carbon emission in the pitlands of the Congo Basin. If we had a price on carbon, that whole region will be able to get extra revenue to ensure its growth. Today, we're talking about a price of carbon of between $2.5 to $5, but even that is not being refunded or rewarded to those countries in the Congo Basin. We believe it should be $18. So either way, we think there should be something that is done to ensure that, you know, those who are helping the planet, protect the planet, and, you know, secure the planet's future get the credits that they deserve. And so as we go to Glasgow and COP26, I think in this reset conversation, a conversation around how we ensure that carbon credits, carbon taxation becomes part of the conversation. Particularly, I think for a very long time, the conversation on climate change has been, Africa didn't cause it, so somebody should pay us. But we are saying Africa is protecting the world. And so, you know, and there is a price for that protection and we deserve it. If we're getting so much subsidy being given to the oil industry for transition, we should get an equivalent subsidy for helping that transition to happen and saving the world. I mean, 3 years of carbon emission storage is nothing to be smiled at. And the risk is if we don't get those resources, the pitlands of the Congo Basin will be used to burn down firewood and 23 million more women will die of respiratory diseases. So just in a sort of quick, and then the big other conversation I think that the COVID-19 crisis has shown us is that we do need some global institutions, and this is my last point, Jennifer, to respond to some of these global external crises. We saw that we just didn't have the right instruments to respond, whether to the health crisis caused by COVID. Every country in some sense became national, people closed down, different reactions to different, you know, now there's talk about a COVID vaccines passport. What happens to those countries that don't have access to the vaccine? Do they then become sort of left to themselves? This virus will mutate in those countries and then it'll come back to us and then we need another vaccine. We need a global, I think, agreement on how we handle some of these kinds of big health pandemics. But going forward, we have also seen the importance of technology, but also, you know, a big struggle, right, between sort of global multilaterals and big powers around technology, 5G, access to information, data storage. And I think we do need also some global and multilateral forums in which we can discuss that. Of course, on trade in general, we now have Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the head of the World Trade Organization. She's going to have a tough task to see how she brings together, you know, the UK, the EU, China, Africa. We have just passed the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So Africa has a position on trade. Is that consistent with the global position? I think those are some of the big issues going forward that we will have to talk about and see how we can sort of, you know, address them. If these are not well addressed, the risk of inequality getting bigger, getting wider, and then me, you know, joining a little bit what Professor Mayaki said, you know, us seeing a little bit more unrest, civil unrest across the world. We've seen it in the United States and we're seeing it in Africa and in the Middle East. This is unrest because of lack of resources, lack of prosperity. People are seeing 20 years of their efforts go down in flames because of the economic and the health crisis. So I think we do need quickly to start addressing these issues. Otherwise, you know, the global reset will become a lot more difficult. Once again, very sorry for joining you late. And thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Vera. That was really excellent. Lots of good points for kind of US policy folks in the room as well to kind of work on and consider and push. So thank you very much. I'm going to now turn to Dr. Khaled Sherif. Welcome. And then we'll, after that, we'll turn to some questions and answers from the audience. So Dr. Sherif, again, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and very good to be back in a GW forum. So first and foremost, obviously talking after Dr. Mayaki and my dear friend, Vera Songwe, it's always
getting harder.
Always great to see you both. And NEPAD and of course, ECA play a very important role in African development. But I think I'm going to go a slightly different route in my discussion. First, just to give context, talk a little bit about Africa pre-COVID and some of the pre-existing fragilities that the continent is facing and continues to face. So first and foremost, I think the first thing that needs to be clear to everyone listening in today is Africa's GDP has been rising in real terms over the past decade, but GDP per capita has declined in real terms, even though it's grown in nominal terms. So obviously, there are some countries that don't follow this trend, but when you aggregate everything and you smoothen out the curve, how can it be that Africa's GDP is rising in real terms, but Africa's GDP per capita is not? And so you end up with a paradigm that Africa is getting richer as a continent, but Africans are getting poorer. And this was pre-COVID, and the situation is now obviously much more complex. So we can explain part of this in the context of 54 countries in Africa. We have 21 of them that depend on 3 to 5 exports for approximately 30 to 70% of their total revenues. So as goes the commodity markets for key exports, mostly raw materials, as goes the wealth of nations. So we have the big six that depend on oil for about 70% of their total revenues, not just their foreign exchange revenues, but their total revenues. And so when we saw oil prices collapse midway into the crisis, the COVID crisis, we also saw these 6 countries go into serious fiscal distress. Other countries rely on the exports of precious metals or a variety of agricultural goods, foremost among them coffee and cocoa beans. And so for West Africa, as goes the coffee and cocoa bean commodity markets, goes the wealth of the nations in West Africa. So if you look at total exports, total commodity exports for Africa, Africa depends on approximately 70 commodity exports, mostly raw materials, for approximately 38% of its total revenues, just 70 commodities. So of those 70 commodities, what COVID-19 has done is it's decimated the prices of those exports for approximately 61 of the 70. And while oil has now rebounded in a big way, commodity markets or commodity prices for coffee beans, cocoa beans continue to struggle, meaning that parts of our continent continue to struggle. Others did have some benefit. For example, Sierra Leone did benefit as a result of the big surge in the price of gold, being a net gold exporter, but this is a rare case. So we have 38 countries on the African continent, 38 countries of 54 countries, with GDP of less than $80 billion, some of them mix, and 10 fragile states with GDP of less than $5 billion, 2 of which have GDP of less than $1 billion. So these are, in the majority of our 54 countries in Africa, many have not seen growth rates in GDP that have basically been the leap that China has seen. And worse, some of our countries in fragility have actually seen a step backward. And all of this was pre-COVID. Pre-COVID unemployment in 12 fragile African countries was in excess of 30%. And we have countries like South Africa, where even though as you develop, unemployment has continued to be a persistent problem, ranging over the past decade between 27% and 38%. But we also have 14 African countries where people live off less than $2 a day, and 28 of our 54 African countries where people live off less than $5 a day. So let's focus on the countries where people live off less than $2 a day and the link to unemployment as a result. So of course, we all know that labor demand is a derived demand derived from the demand for goods and services. So when you have people living off less than $2 a day, they have no disposable income. In turn, they have no consumption. If they have no consumption, they basically are only demanding staples. And so there's no signal to the private sector to invest. If there's no signal to the private sector to invest, in turn, there's basically no signal to generate employment other than for extractives. And this is what we see in these countries. We see the wealth coming in the form of foreign direct investment, because the extractives companies are there to basically buy precious metals, to extract them, to mine them. But domestic growth isn't being fueled because we're not able to get beyond the $2 a day phenomenon. And as I said, even for the countries where people live off less than $5 a day, you don't really have the consumption that will then signal the private sector to invest and then in turn employ and then in turn create additional wealth. So wealth creation has lagged behind. And this is where we end up with the reality of what I was saying earlier. The continent is getting richer because extractives are making it richer, but the people of the continent are not getting richer. And this is why we have the persistent unemployment problems. So the middle income countries pre-COVID had unemployment that averaged about 28%, very, very high. Africa has very weak comparative advantage. I mean, you obviously can't produce goods cheaper than anyone else if you don't have economies of scale. So to try and industrialize Africa, you're competing against the Chinas of the world. And if you can't produce something that can compete against the per unit cost of industrial giants, well, you end up just exporting your precious metals, your oils, your coffee beans, your cocoa beans, etc. So most of the multilaterals pre-COVID, their strategy aimed at developing regional value chains to be able to try and begin to promote industrial growth, to begin to bring wealth back to the continent, because without them, without these regional value chains, you can't really obviously promote wealth or wealth creation. So you export the cocoa beans, but you don't make the chocolate. You export the coffee beans, but you don't export coffee, the ground coffee. And you export the raw diamonds, but you don't polish them and put them on a stone. And so depending on the value addition that's lost, it's per commodity several $1,000s worth of value addition, depending on what you're looking at. And so the wealth isn't coming to Africa, it's going somewhere else. So the focus has been on these regional value chains. And these are important because we're seeing in Africa things that we don't see anywhere in the world, the breakdown of basic economic principles. So we had, for example, in Morocco had a series of devaluations over 3 years that was close to about 40% of its currencies. And for many of its basic exports, they actually declined. Now, how can you reduce the value of your currency, devalue it by 30 to 40%, and then see your exports decline? Well, the reason that happens is, say, for example, Morocco has a very large automobile industry, which is an export industry, but it's an assembly industry. So they buy kits and they use cheap Moroccan labor to produce vehicles. But when you basically decrease the value of your domestic currency, the cost of importing the kit to assemble the car actually goes up by the percentage of the valuation. And so you end up with a car that you're manufacturing that's now more expensive to you because the kits cost you more to import. We see that across the board. So Exports, when we saw devaluations across the African continent over the past decade, we actually see devaluations where effectively exports are inelastic rather than elastic. And that's just because we don't have supply chains. So the focus to address that was on regional integration and, as I said, to promote economies of scale. Multilaterals have tried to promote FDI growth, invest in public-private partnerships for infrastructure investments to enhance import substitution, also as a vehicle for job creation. But the focus on promoting wealth creation, which has always been key, was this whole concept of making sure that you can find a way of developing developing regional value chains to try and bring back some of the wealth on the continent. Now, additionally, we focused on promoting labor mobility, opening up countries for business, focused on property rights, because we have two countries, for example, of our 54, where citizens and non-citizens of two of these countries can only lease land, but they can't buy it. So how are you going to invest when you can't actually even own the land that you're in the country you're trying to invest in? But we still have problems with investment codes in particular countries. Of our 54 countries, 43 saw declines in domestic revenues ranging from 35 to 70% as a result of what happened with COVID-19. But when we talk about declines in revenues, commodity prices as they collapsed, and since the continent really is dependent on 70 primary exports, when about 61 of those exports, so those commodities, crashed on commodity markets, then we started seeing many countries going into severe fiscal distress. COVID paralyzed regional trade. For example, Zimbabwe was hard hit when South Africa closed its borders. So Zimbabwe had no country to sell its agricultural products to. When COVID-19 hit, we had 8 countries that were struggling to pay civil service wages, pensioners, and struggling to pay their external debt. That's because their fiscal space effectively evaporated. For the big 6 oil producers, when you bet your entire budget on oil being sold for $55 to $60 a barrel, and then you were only getting $20 to $35 a barrel for the majority of 2020, how do you make up that space? So this is when all of these countries that were seriously affected by declines in commodity markets started needing stimulus. We also saw state-owned enterprises starting to fail, among them South African airlines. We saw private sector firms affected by lockdowns facing the same threats that we saw in Europe and in the US. This is when the African Development Bank decided to act quickly and design the crisis relief facility. This is the hole I have been hiding in for the past year and a half. So our crisis relief facility was really one of the first vehicles completely focused on providing stimulus for the 54 African nations, now the majority of which were facing fiscal distress as a result of COVID-19. So for the African Development Bank, very much like the World Bank, we had to completely retool our lending and grant programs to focus exclusively on providing stimulus to countries facing fiscal distress. And I'll come back to the CRF in a second. Africa needed the stimulus just like everybody else. They needed the money for the fiscal space that they no longer had. They needed the money for food imports. They needed the money for medical supplies. They needed to buy fuel in many countries to generate electricity, even though the cost of it was now lower because commodity markets had collapsed on the oil side. But if you don't have the money to buy it, well, you're going to be thrown into the dark. So we also then started seeing countries beginning to default on external debt payments. Zambia was the first example. Then this was followed by several country downgrades from rating agencies, making it extremely difficult for countries to borrow in the short term. In agriculture, because of COVID-19, several countries couldn't afford to buy fertilizer and seeds, jeopardizing their planting season. So not only are the prices for coffee beans and cocoa beans collapsing, but now you don't even have the money to buy the fertilizer and the seeds that you need prior to a planting season. So the World Bank, the IMF, and the African Development Bank came together and designed a package for about $110 billion worth of stimulus, all working hand in hand to make sure that we can help countries adversely affected to shore up their fiscal space. But all we provided was $110 billion for 1.3 billion Africans, when at the same time, we were looking at a level of stimulus going into Asia, going into the Americas, going into Europe, that was in excess of about $11 trillion. Africa got $110 billion. So with that challenge, what the African Development Bank tried to do with the Crisis Relief Facility was we stopped all of our financial flows, shut down a variety of projects, and focused it all on budget support with the objective of getting $10 billion in immediate cash to our 54 regional member countries. We've now dispersed about $5 billion of that. And if I were to say, have I ever had a bigger challenge than getting this crisis relief facility put into place? No. We canceled or put on hold over 600 projects, and we redesigned and retooled our entire lending and grant provisioning programs, especially to deal with this crisis. But now, as the crisis is beginning to lessen, we're hearing the term, how do we build back better? And obviously, Dr. Mayaki, Vera, and I have always had the luxury of dealing with acronyms of different types throughout our careers in the development business. But when the term came up, BBB, Build Back Better, nobody actually ever told us what this meant. So we kind of had to interpret it in our own ways. So at least for the African Development Bank, what do we know has to happen to be able to build back better? So in Africa, only 35% of total revenue comes from domestic taxation, 35%. I mean, there's no continent in the world that has this kind of threshold. So 3 of every $10 come from corporate taxation or income taxation, where if you look at the US, it's closer to 7. So why is that? Well, primarily because the informal sector is so big. So many countries, whether it be Nigeria, whether it be Egypt, whether it be South Africa, whether it be Kenya, whether it be Tanzania or Uganda, the informal sector doesn't want to go formal. They want to continue to operate, but not pay taxes. And this has been a challenge across the board. And now, especially given that the informal sector is such an important cornerstone of many of these economies, how we begin to formalize the informal sector has to be part of building back better, because if you can only raise 35% of your revenues from domestic taxation, then you're completely dependent on these 70 exports for the continent and how commodity markets may work for you or against you. And many of these commodities are shorted from time to time, like we saw with coffee beans. We also, to build back better, need to develop social safety nets and a system for social protection that clearly wasn't there. So even when I did get money to countries that needed it desperately, they had the secondary problem of getting it to the people that were most affected, that were the unemployed. So most of the money was used to shore up the monies needed to pay pensioners, to pay civil servants, but the people from the private sector, in the formal private sector, were getting a trickle down of the money that was going to others. So this is a part of building back better. We need to diversify these economies. I mean, we cannot have a situation where 20 plus countries in the African continent of our 54 are dependent on 3 exports and tourism. anything can go wrong with commodity markets. And so when tourism dried up, when workers' remittances basically began to dwindle for a country like Kenya, because many of the Kenyans working across the globe now are finding themselves unemployed. Without tourism, with dwindling workers' remittances, with 3 exports, even our mix started to struggle. But in West Africa, if you're depending primarily on exporting cocoa beans and coffee beans, and that those commodity market prices dry up, then what do you do? So diversification becomes key. And we need to get growth back on track. I mean, Egypt was the only country that grew in real terms in 2020. And the other thing, when we talk about growing the African economy, we have to remember that 600 million people of our 1.3 billion citizens of the African continent still live without access to electricity, and 110 million of those people are in urban areas. But imagine 600 million people on the African continent that are still living off kerosene and candles, mostly in communities that time has forgotten, where you don't have electricity or potable water. So what do we do to correct this? And so we have problems even of availability of existing power within the grid infrastructure in urban areas in countries like Nigeria, Tanzania, Ghana, Liberia, and more than 95 million people in these urban areas. In these countries, our mix, with the exception of Liberia, even when the grid exists, are still living in the dark. You won't get investment when you don't have power. There's an absolute need for community development in areas like the Sahel, where major parts of the Sahel countries make up regions, whole regions with no access to power or potable water. Community development strategies where extreme poverty resides is key to preventing rampant urbanization and an offset to migration trends. So years ago, many of the people connected to this who've been in the business for a long time will remember Stern's concept of Millennium Villages that was supposed to be key to developing the African continent. And it was a focus on those communities, those villages, those towns where extreme poverty resided, and we're still dealing with these problems. And we're also now beginning to see, especially in the Sahel, terrorism coming from these communities without power, without potable water, consistent with the African saying that if you look down at your plate and you see nothing, you look up to God. And this is a problem that has to be addressed in building back better. There is a need to regionally integrate. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is absolutely key. What the AU's vision, the African Union's vision for developing regional economic communities is key. The work that NEPAD is doing is absolutely key as our socioeconomic flagship. NEPAD's 4 primary objectives to eradicate poverty, promote sustainable growth and development, integrate Africa into the world economy, and accelerate the empowerment of women is the foundation for what we all are trying to do before and post-COVID. And we need to end Africa's dependence on food imports. For those of you that don't know, Africa imports $35 billion worth of foodstuffs. $35 billion worth of foodstuffs. So when Africa's commodity exports collapsed and everyone was hoarding food, we were looking at scenarios where major countries, some of them like Zimbabwe, were not going to be able to import the food that they needed, the basic staples to feed their populations, because nobody was exporting, even if you had the money. So I could give them the money from stimulus, but who could they buy it from? South Africa wasn't willing to export staples, and it became a serious crisis for a period in time. But Sudan itself can feed the entire African continent with all of the land that's available that has yet to be farmed and irrigated. So how can we address the issue of making sure that Africa's dependence on food imports is addressed? We need strategic industries. Pharmaceuticals is a perfect example of what we're seeing. Africa is completely dependent on getting its COVID-19 vaccines from outside the continent. It doesn't have the production facilities for strategic industries like pharmaceuticals. I mean, India has that capacity. None of our mix have the capacity to address even the provision of vaccines for the continent. We need to address the concentration of wealth, not just in middle-income countries, but across the continent, even in fragile states. So what we've seen is deteriorating Gini coefficients in our mix, a lack of even regional development, and enhanced fragility in areas such as the Sahel that I was talking about, which obviously carry the potential risk of just sporadic civil unrest.
Dr. Sherif, I do want to save time for discussion. So are you, yeah.
I'll just close in 2 minutes.
Okay.
So the last point I'd like to make is just simply on Zambia and countries like Zambia that now have government debt of about 120% of GDP. So for many of the countries that fell into fiscal distress that were already facing a debt crisis, we now have 18 countries that are on the IMF's list of serious debt distress. So a follow-up HIPC discussion for many countries is going to be needed. China is trying to help, but I think there's a broader issue because Eurobonds, which is another big topic that many of them that have been the source of trying to find money for development will mature in 2023 and beyond, putting serious stress on many countries, especially our mix. The debt issue is a big, big problem. But the point that I want to close with is wealth creation. If we're going to build back better, the only thing the cookie that we need to break, so to speak, is this whole concept of a continent where, of our 54 countries, 18 countries, people living off less than $2 a day, and an additional 20 where people live off less than $5 a day. Unless we create wealth and find a vehicle for doing so, whether it be through value chains or other, Africa will be mired in serious developmental challenges, and it's time for Africa to overcome those challenges. Apologies for my long-winded.
Fantastic. Thank you. And yeah, as you say, I mean, many of these problems existed. The solutions now are more urgent, but also more difficult going forward. Just one thing I might add to that list, just a personal interest of mine, is also stopping the illicit financial flows out of Africa is a big one for me, and one where the international community has a big role to play for those things within its purview. So just to add that on to that list. Thank you to all three of our speakers, really, for three very complimentary presentations. I do want to open it up for questions. I wanted to turn to see if my colleague El Gassim had a first question. And I see that Ambassador Mula has a hand up as well. El Gassim, would you like to take the first crack?
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thanks, of course, to the panelists. Well, I have to tread carefully because I'm not an expert on economy. This is a layman question. I'm wondering, since we're dealing with people with excellent expertise on the issues, when I see what the Europeans did, in the context of the European Union, borrowing jointly to fund their own recovery. The US, of course, can do stuff on its own, and they have the largest recovery plan ever in their history. And we as Africans, when I look at what we have done so far, there are, of course, efforts at national level, but we're relying a lot on external support, debt relief, debt cancellation. And I don't know, as far as I know, debt did not really lead to development in Africa. Isn't it possible for the continent to take advantage of the exceptional circumstances we are in to initiate creative, innovative programs that would further integration? And one of them would be to launch a recovery plan that would be funded by domestic resources, but also by joint borrowing. And we have seen it happening in the context of OMVS, the River Basin Management Organization that brings together Mauritania, Senegal, Guinea, and Mali, where they borrow jointly on the international markets. Can't we do it? I'm saying, of course, I know it's complicated, but it's precisely in difficult situations that we break new ground. Is it technically possible to do it? I don't know how it works out. So that's my question to the three panelists. Thank you so much.
Great. Let's take Ambassador Mula as well, and then we'll turn back to the panel, and we'll come back with groups of questions if we could. Ambassador Mula.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I just wanted to add my voice, Jennifer, to thank you all our distinguished panelists for making time, but also for your very informative and insightful presentations. I've learned a lot today. And Vera, I'm happy to see you, though virtually. We have been together and that's why I bring my question later, if you allow me. So my question is first to Dr. Mayaki. I really enjoyed your analysis, but then I wanted to ask you one question, because I know NEPAD is an arm of the African Union. Within the African Union, Dr. Mayaki, there have been so many task forces being established on food security, on distribution of vaccines. There is also, of course, the overall task force on COVID. And for each task force, there is always this statement that this will be done in a coordinated way, a holistic approach. But then when you read the terms of each task force, of course, they report to different either expert committees. So my question is, Dr. Mayaki, because that's always our weaknesses, especially in multilateral forums. How do you see a coordinated approach when you have so many of these segments, and each one, of course, working on their, of course, areas of competence? But with NEPAD has to be, of course, holistic. So this is what I wanted, and I also wanted to bring you, which of course Vera has touched on, that if you want to see any performance, you look at the budget, not the strategic plans. So the amount that is required for, of course, COVID response, but also post-COVID recovery, it's so enormous. So I'm glad, of course, Vera brought in the SDR issue. So maybe I don't want to insist on you, because I was saying there are so many strategic plans that within these task forces, but where will the resources come from? So that was my question. But to Vera, I thank you. Before you came, Dr. Mayaki said anything of details about economic issues, I leave it to Vera. But as he was concluding, he mentioned a very important area, gender issues. And he said, and thank you, Dr. Mayaki, for saying it, he said the women empowerment is an economic issue. But then knowing every time gender issues are like add-ons. I know you are a strong supporter of our African Leadership Network gender issues. Since you didn't mention anything about gender, I want you to bring it in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's start there. And folks in the audience, if you do have a question, raise your hand, use the little reaction button at the bottom. I think that will be the easiest rather than using the chat function. So let's turn back to the panelists. Who would like to respond first? Dr. Mayaki?
Okay, so let me try to answer to a question which was asked by Ambassador on the complexity of the landscape of task forces and the difficulties of coordination, etc. I must say two things. The first one is the African Union was heavily criticized, as I said, because we did an analysis on the basis of what are called specialized technical committees, which are gatherings of ministers on sectoral issues which take decisions going back to the assembly. And we realized that 75% of the decisions before the reform, which were taken were not implemented. So the reform that President Kagame led was really to shake the structures and the processes of the African Union and come out with clear pathways The first pathway was systematic common positions. You see it with the CFTA, you see it with response to COVID, through the CDC. Systematic common position do allow a better coordination. And the second point was a division of labor, which could not be perfect. Why? Because the African Union is an intergovernmental organization. It's not a supranational organization like the EU. So it depends a lot on the determination of individual countries to adhere to the decisions which are taken. And given that fact, evidently, coordination is not easy. So you need a buy-in. And in order to construct that buy-in, you need task forces. And well, if you have a lot of task forces, evidently coordination is a problem, but it's the way to go because it's the DNA of the organization which implies that you need task forces. But I must say that enormous progresses have been made in terms of coordination. I will just give two examples. In infrastructure today, we have what we call PIDA, which is a program for infrastructure development in Africa, where the African Development Bank is a critical actor. So we have a list of priority projects, which are transboundary projects and based on corridors. And these transboundary corridors with very specific projects are really supported by regional economic communities. And there is a division of labor between what the regional economic communities are supposed to do, what the Commission is supposed to do in terms of supervision, and what member states are supposed to do in terms of enhancing the capacity to manage regionally on the basis of focal points, etc. So I won't go into the details, but just to say that enormous progresses have been made in terms of coordination, and it is ongoing, but the DNA of organization, not being supranational, has a direct consequence on the way we implement. Point number, the second point is regarding the question that Professor Wan asked. The level of optimality of solutions regarding integration, it's a tautology. It's at the regional level. We cannot, 55 African countries cannot really develop the energy sector by having national policies disconnected from one another. The optimal solutions are at the regional level. Whether it is about energy, agriculture, even education, the optimality is at regional level. So, and this is a question of leadership. In a region like East Africa, well, the strength of the regional integration process has been so high that they plan together and they implement together, which allows them to have a regional market which doesn't look like what happens in West Africa or in Central Africa, which is really the least integrated region in the continent. So you have several Africas, but these several Africas, the level of integration fundamentally depends on how the leadership is determined to move towards regional integration. So let me stop here on these two questions. Well, the aspect of just 1 minute. As implementers of PIDA and infrastructure, we gathered 5-6 years ago several sovereign pension funds, several American pension funds at the NASDAQ in order to pitch our infrastructure project. And a pension fund CEO of Texas told me, why do you want us to invest in Africa's infrastructure? Why your pension funds are investing in Australia and in the UK and in US highways? So that's because if you look at the assets under management of African pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, it's over $1 trillion, $1.3 trillion, something like that. So, but they invest very, they were investing less than 1% in Africa's infrastructure. That's what led us to define what we call a 5% agenda, go to de-risking strategies, work with the African Development Bank in order to try to see what kind of guarantee mechanisms could be put in place. And I end here.
Yeah, great, thank you. Vera, I wanted to turn to you on Ambassador Mulamula's question about gender. And maybe if you could say a little bit more on the on-lending issue and you know, kind of the receptivity to that or precedent for that or likelihood or what you're hearing in terms of responses.
I mean, maybe let me start with that. The on-lending issue is the SDR, since this is a little bit my work now. So the special drawing rights, and it links with the other question, including Ambassador Muller's question. So thanks for coming back to that. We have precedent. The first time where sort of the global community came together to issue SDRs was in 2008, 2009 during the global financial crisis. Of course, at the time, the global financial crisis was mostly hitting the G20 economies. So we didn't have a lot of discussion around the SDRs as we have now, because it was, you know, those 20 countries, they got together and they issued SDRs to themselves. But every time SDRs are issued, everybody gets some, but most of it goes to the developed countries, as I have shown. And so essentially in 2008, 2009, when that happened, a country like the United States had already given itself a stimulus package, and so didn't really need an extra allocation of SDRs. What they did generously at the time then was to on-lend some of their SDRs to the IMF's Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. So it has happened before. And it is actually, thank God that they did that then, that the IMF had some liquidity to respond to this crisis. But of course, this crisis is 50 times bigger. Africa is in its first recession in 25 years. And so even though the IMF doubled down and sort of, you know, doubled the quota allocations to countries, we didn't have nearly enough resources to be able to give out countries like Egypt and Morocco. So if you think that Africa is going to get $25 billion from the SDRs, just in terms of overall sort of scale, the South Africa got 5 billion from the international community, Egypt got 6 billion, Morocco got 5 billion. That's already 16 billion of 25 billion to 3 countries on the continent. So if you're thinking, how do you distribute 25 billion, you can just see that it doesn't work. Yeah. I think the other problem, and the reason we're talking about on lending, is that even though one of the initiatives that the ECA, the Economic Commission for Africa, and African finance ministers sort of championed, which was the debt suspension initiative, delivered $5 billion in fiscal space to Africa, it essentially went to low-income African countries and middle-income African. So a lot of the vulnerable, this crisis is different because it's not hitting the poor, it's hitting the vulnerable, it's hitting those who are exposed to the tourism sector, it's hitting those who are exposed to trade, who have open economies. So essentially, the response has punished the good performers. A country like Seychelles, 70% of its revenue comes from tourism. It's gone to zero, but they haven't gotten any help because they're considered middle income. A country like Morocco has suffered really, really badly from the COVID crisis itself, just continued, you know, suffering, but they haven't gotten additional support because they're considered a middle income country. So I think what we are also trying to say with the SDRs is, let's see whether we can use the SDRs to rebalance some of the response to the crisis in a way that works. So this is where the on-lending comes in. We already have precedent with the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. Many African countries were doing well before the crisis, and I want to say this again. When we say 18 countries are in the IMF debt distress list, it's 54 of us. So there is, you know, 30 something of us that are not. And I think that we also do need to move away from just talking about actually the 8 that were already in debt distress and the others that can still come out of this conundrum if they get the liquidity that they require. And so what we are saying is when African economies go to the markets, and I take the example of Benin that just went to the markets, Benin was growing at 7% before this crisis. You know, they're going to the market to borrow $1 billion at 6.85 basis points. US interest rates are 1%. Japanese are negative 48. Benin is borrowing at 6.85. This is the biggest injustice happening during COVID. It's a positive net transfer of resources from a Benin that does not have enough to Eurobond markets. So what we are saying is, can we use some of these SDRs, which essentially are concessional money, to buy down the interest rate exposure so that rather than Benin borrowing at 6.85, they go to the markets at 3. The whole conversation around debt sustainability is not about bad economics. It is about expensive credit. If you borrow at 6.85, you will have a debt crisis in 5 years because it becomes expensive to pay back, especially that we're borrowing at 6.85 with shorter maturities. If we're going to borrow at 6.85, we want to borrow at longer maturities. So we're hoping that the SDRs can help us do that. First of all, reduce the cost of borrowing and extend the maturities. That will allow us, and I just take a very sort of maybe conceptual example. If you go to African countries, and I think it was Khaled who talked about energy, you know, it takes us 6, 7, 8, 9 years to build a hydropower plant. If you borrow for 5 years for a plant that in 7 years is not paying back for itself, you're in a debt crisis. Because even though what you're borrowing for is useful investment and it's an investment that will pay back a return, when the time to pay back the return comes, you are not yet ready because you are not yet getting back your investment. And so I think one of the things that we want to talk about in this reset environment is, can we extend maturities, including the IMF, by the way. Khaled talked a lot about the Sahel countries. Even the Sahel countries, when they borrow from the IMF today, they borrow over 3-year periods. We know that conflict-affected countries need 5, 6, 7 years to come back into being. And so I think some extension of maturities from development institutions to the markets is important. So this is the SDR story and the conversation that we're having. And this is where I think US leadership, and I go back to US leadership, I think everybody else is talking about Africa. I want to talk about US leadership because I think we're talking to some of the US administration. This is where US leadership is really important. The benefit of buying down market access is that you get transparency. One of the big conversations around Africa's debt today is 40% of Africa's debt is on Eurobond markets. We know where it is, we know its maturity, and we know what it's for. Another 40% is on bilaterals. China, Italy, India, Turkey, you know, the United States and everybody else. And then we have concessional lending, which is another 20%, the World Bank, the African Development Bank. So the big problem, we will never be able to go back to a HIPIC because the big problem or the big new nature of the debt question on the continent today is not, when we had HIPIC, 80% of Africa's debt was multilateral debt. So you had 7 countries get together and figure it out. Today we have bilateral debts, private sector debt, Eurobond debt, ECA debt with commercial banks. Africa is a lot more sophisticated in its financial landscape. And so it's very difficult. That's why even the G20 debt framework, which we embrace, that just came out, is still proving an exercise in how do we do it. And Chad and Ethiopia and Zambia will give us a sense of how we get around to having that conversation in a way that works. But this was a long answer to a short question, but I think important to maybe clarify some of those issues. On Ambassador, so I don't know, Jennifer, I hope I answered your question.
Yes, yeah, no, excellent, yeah.
Thank you. And so we're hoping with US leadership, we can get this on lending conversation going and provide a faster and a little bit more liquidity. On Ambassador Muller's question on women, it's 50% of our population. And I did sort of say it maybe in passing and very quickly. I talked about sort of the green recovery and the fact that 23 million African women get sick and eventually pass away because of respiratory diseases because they're burning fossil fuels for cooking. And one of the things actually that we have seen during the COVID crisis is that because our health systems have been so stretched, you know, we haven't been able to attend to other illnesses because we've all been responding to COVID. But the other thing is that our health workers have been at the front lines, and most of our health workers are women. And that's why, again, for the SDRs, we're saying, can the SDRs help us get these vaccines quickly? Because the best way, the first way today on our continent to protect women is to vaccinate our nurses, vaccinate our frontline workers, get to herd immunity so that our economies can go back. Now, the second thing is on vulnerability. And of course, women are mostly in the informal sector. One of the things that the Economic Commission for Africa did when the crisis started and we started thinking about vulnerabilities, we realized that many of these women are vulnerable, but are not in any formal poverty reduction or social safety net systems. So we got together with 7 of the largest telco companies on the continent, and we created what is called the African Communications Information Platform, where essentially we have today a database of about 714 million telephone users. And we can send messages to them saying, are you hungry? Do you have food today? And what we're trying to do with that is establish where are the vulnerable communities, who are the vulnerable in the communities, and then make sure that that data goes back to governments that can provide assistance. Post the crisis, we hope that using this database, we can move from informality to formality with many of these women. Of course, the question of informality to formality is also a question of social contract. Is the government giving me enough so that I can pay taxes? And the question, I think, as Khaled has ably answered, is that the social contract in many of our economies is still very weak, and we need to keep building it. But maybe, I think, as Professor Mayaki said, one of the times where I think Africa has responded well and responded collectively, and hopefully that social contract is beginning to bear fruit, is with the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, but also some of the COVID response. And hopefully that encourages more people to come into formality, because systems are being put in place that can reward, I think, the entry into formality of a small and medium enterprise businesswoman. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jennifer, can I come in just very quickly for Mr. Al-Gassim's question, because it's a very important question, just in 1 minute.
Yes.
Sorry, I forgot your question 1, but yeah, Khaled, why don't you do that, and then I'll take over if Khaled, yeah.
So just on the question of how can we borrow to fund the recovery rather than external support, one of the things you have to keep in mind is this has become complex because many of our regional member countries, many of the 54 countries in Africa, especially the ones that are really dependent on exporting commodities for the revenue streams, have hedged what they have to export. So for example, Ghana has effectively sold its coffee beans through 2023. Ivory Coast has sold its coffee beans through 2024. China has been very good at coming into countries where there was fiscal distress in 2020 and saying, we will give you the short-term liquidity you need in exchange for a barter deal for getting access to mine X, marble, uranium from Niger, whatever it may be. So we have a whole dedicated instrument, the African Legal Support Facility, that's now trying to figure out ways of undoing some really bad deals that happened in 2020. But to fund your recovery from the inside, since you only have about 35% of revenue comes from domestic sources like taxation, everyone that found themselves in serious crisis did hedge their future exports, and this makes that situation more problematic.
We are at time, and I'm feeling very bad for Anthony D'Amico, who has had his hand up very patiently throughout. But unfortunately, I know that our guests have other commitments, and I do think we're going to have to wrap up now. Anthony, I do apologize. To our panelists, just a big thanks for 3 tremendous and in-depth presentations. We have taped this and we are going to post this on the website, and we'll provide links to those that have attended and those who haven't, because I think I could listen to this again just to get deep into the details once again. So Dr. Mayaki, Dr. Songwe, and Dr. Sherif, I just thank you from all of us, and thank you to those who joined us today. Please join me in thanking our guests. Again, everyone, Really fantastic panel. So. Yeah, so with that, I'll bring things to a close. If folks want to stay on just to give any feedback, you're most welcome to do so.